Okay, so welcome. This is our first chapter lecture. Chapter 1, we're just doing an overview of drug use. Okay, a lot of these first chapters have vocabulary words in them, and I say vocabulary words, but I really mean concepts. Those will quite likely be on your first exam. So if I am sort of talking about something that is a definition or a concept, make sure that you write it down, make sure that you are remembering it, that you really get it. As I talk, I am covering some of the material that is in the book. If there is a topic or a specific area that I talk about and you think that you're really interested in that, and I really didn't give enough attention to it, again, go to your book. There's a lot more information on each specific thing there. You can also feel free to email me if you have questions. You can always look things up online. Do keep in mind, though, that sometimes things that are online are not 100% accurate. Okay, some of the things are, some of the things are not. So be careful. View things with a critical eye, with an educated eye. All right, let's get going here. So let's see if I can make this work here. Click. Okay, fabulous. So here we go. Let me see if I can move something that's on my screen. Okay. So first of all, when we talk about drug use, we want to differentiate it from abuse, from problematic use, and then we want to say, okay, so when do we say it's use and when do we say it's abuse? People are going to have different opinions on this. We have different thresholds for what we consider okay and not okay. So let's talk about this. All right, our concern about the use of a substance really depends on a few things. One, who is using the substance, all right? So we have this idea, and I say we meaning sort of the general public, and again, not everybody. So any generalizations I make, just remember that I know that that does not actually mean everybody. But a lot of people have this idea that having a glass of wine with dinner, if you are an adult, is appropriate, okay? And I'm talking one glass. But when we say who is using it, so if someone who is over the age of 21 is using alcohol, then we might say, yeah, I feel okay about that. However, if we talk about maybe a 12-year-old just on her own pouring herself a glass of wine, we feel uncomfortable, okay? And a lot about, when it comes down to drugs, our feelings about drugs, our laws about drugs, a lot of it is based on that gut reaction, right? We have this gut reaction that seeing a 12-year-old drinking makes us uncomfortable. And that feeling makes us say it must be wrong, right? This is not scientific. This is just this sort of gut visceral reaction that people have. And we have that, differently to each different drug. So, like I said, who is using it? Often we're talking about age here. How much is being used? So again, if we're talking one glass of wine versus like downing a handle of vodka by yourself, again, we have different ideas. And I'll just use alcohol as our example for this. So age matters, how much we're using matters, when matters, right? So we have, again, this idea of like, if it's after 5 o'clock, then it's cool to have a drink. If it's, 9 a.m., we're going to give people kind of a sketchy look and say, what is wrong with you? Unless, of course, it's brunch. And then we seem to think that that's okay. You can see how our sort of societal norms of when may, again, not have a lot of actual scientific data behind them, but just the way that we feel about things. Where? Okay, again, if you're using in a safe situation, people tend to be okay with it. If you are going to an abandoned building to drink alcohol, people feel uncomfortable with it. Okay, so where? Why is it being used? And as a psychologist, this is a very important one to me, and it's an important one to, well, a lot of us. And that is, are you having one beverage in order to, maybe it's part of your ritual, maybe it's part of just, kicking back a little bit at the end of the day, feeling like it's a reward. And again, for some people, even that's not okay. But a lot of people do feel like that's okay. The concern is, are you using alcohol to numb yourself from reality, to escape from reality, to avoid all reality? And that's where we have what we consider problematic behaviors, is if people are using substances because they can't stand the thought of dealing with the real world, dealing with the anxiety they feel in the real world, dealing with the pain that they feel in the real world, dealing with the depression that they feel in the real world, whatever it is. That's where we start to really get concerned about substance use and abuse. Okay, hopefully all of that made sense. If not, you go back to your book. Moving on. Okay. Click. There we go. So let's talk about these general principles. Okay, and again, you'll want to know these things. Use is not necessarily abuse. Okay, most users of any given substance do not use it in a way that can be defined as abuse or dependence. And I say any given substance, and that is, there are people that use cocaine who are actually just using randomly, recreationally, and are not actually abusing or dependent on it. Now, some of you might say, well, any use of cocaine is abuse. Well, people are going to have different thoughts about that, okay? Every drug has multiple effects, and this, when we get into later on in the semester, when we talk specifically about drugs, each drug specifically, that is, we will talk about the multiple effects of the drug. Now, a user may only be seeking one effect. However, the drug is working at multiple sites in the brain and other organs. I think it's really important for people to be aware of what that drug is doing in their body, pros and cons, right? And the amount matters. So larger doses, more frequent doses, faster onset of effects, these all produce different effects compared to small doses. And this is, again, for any drug we're talking about, okay? And when I say faster onset of effects, we're going to talk about that often. Things that hit you quickly, so things that if you shoot it, snort it, those kind of things are going to hit you faster than if you ingest it and it has to go through your digestive tract. Things that have a faster onset are more likely to be addictive, quickly addictive. Again, we'll talk about that more, just want to throw it out there now. A user's history and expectations affect drug-related effects. An experienced user may experience different effects compared to an inexperienced user. So again, I go back to alcohol here. And this is, you may have your, high school, early college student who is drinking, a wine cooler for the first time and ends up being belligerent. Or you can have a, long-term alcoholic who can literally drink like a liter of straight vodka and somehow appear as though they are functioning. Same thing goes with all the other drugs. Expectations may make a drug effect more or less likely to occur, okay? So again, you sort of use this like teenager who like totally wants to drink alcohol and like totally thinks that that might make them crazy, and so they do, and then they act crazy. Even though technically the amount they had shouldn't make that happen. Or if you feel like, well, I know what to expect, it's not going to be that big of a deal, I'm not going to have an effect from it. You know, there are people that can take hallucinogen drugs and actually not experience anything from them because they're so set on not experiencing something from them. Okay. So again, this happens with all the different drugs. And you really do see this like when you give people non-alcoholic beverages that they think are alcoholic, right? So like non-alcoholic beer, when people think they're drinking regular beer, people end up acting drunk, even though they are not. So again, expectations and history affect drug-related effects. Now, something that your book really talks about is that drugs are not good or bad. And what we mean by that is that a drug is just a thing. It sits on a shelf, or it's a chemical. It's just out there. It is not good or bad in itself. Now, when you put it into your body, then we have different effects. And those effects may be, quote, good or, quote, bad. Blaming the substance, though, ignores all the factors that lead to abuse. And the reason that your book talks about this so much, the reason that we all talk about this so much, is that there's so much policy that goes toward trying to get rid of substances. Now, if there's always a demand for substances, there will always be a supply, no matter how hard people try to get rid of it. There just will be a supply somehow. So this is where we kind of need to look at the people using, why they're using, and what can be done about that. And we will talk about that throughout the whole semester, including some of the very last chapters. Okay, next. Here are some important terms. Important terms means write them down. So, drug. A drug is any substance, natural or artificial, other than food, that by its chemical nature alters structure or function in a living organism. Real simple there. It just is what it is. I could elaborate, but it says it what it needs to say here. Now, an illicit drug is a drug that is illegal. It's unlawful to possess, or it's unlawful to use, right? And that's going to be different based on where you live. But so an illicit drug is basically an illegal drug. I hope that's an easy one to memorize. A term that's used often is deviant drug use. Deviant drug use would be that the drug use is not common within a social group, and it's disapproved of by the majority of that social group, right? So deviant drug use among some would be any use at all. Deviant use in, let's say, alcohol in college. Deviant use is going to be if somebody is wasted throughout the day and not going to class at all. That would be more deviant. In certain religious groups, any alcohol use at all is going to be deviant use. Okay. Next term here is drug misuse. So this is use of drugs or chemicals in a greater amount than or for purposes other than those prescribed by a doctor. So when we talk about drug misuse, we're often talking about, we're not always, but we're often talking about prescription medications, right? Our Adderalls, our Xanax, things like that. So drug misuse would be basically you're taking it and it's not prescribed for you, or you're taking more than is prescribed for you. When I ask people about drug misuse, I of course don't say, hey, are you misusing drugs? Guess what the answer is? No, no matter what. I usually say, well, let me give you another example of what I don't say. I don't say, are you taking your medications more often than you're supposed to? Okay, because again, most people will say no. So I usually say, how often are you taking your drugs more often than you're supposed to? Or how often are you taking more medication than your doctor thinks you should be? Okay, so when I say how often, they'll usually say something like, oh, you know, not that often, which means that they are. And then I'll say something like, oh, not that often, like once a day. I always want to go with the question that would be more dramatic than what they're probably already doing, right? So if I say, oh, not that often, like maybe once a year, then they're still going to lie. But if I go with the drama one, like, well, every day, then people will be like, oh, no, not every day. Maybe like once a week. Or if it is every day, they'll say, yeah, it seems about right. Okay. So the reason I say this is when you're talking to people about their drug use, if you ever want to ask questions, ask them as though it's not a big deal. If you ask like it's a big deal or like you're judging them, guess what? That person's going to be lying to you. Which should make sense. Okay. That's more of my clinical side stuff that we talk about. Okay. So drug abuse and drug dependence. Okay. Drug abuse. Drug abuse is substance use in a manner or an amount or in situations that it causes social, occupational, psychological, or physical problems. Now, when we use the word drug dependence, this is really a more precise term than the term addiction. When people use the term addiction, people mean all sorts of different things. So drug dependence is a more definable term. This is a state in which an individual uses a drug so frequently, so consistently, that it would be difficult for the person to stop. Okay? It typically means that the person is using more than they want to be using, or that they are using more often than they would like to be. So there's that. It may or may not be physiological. So some people will say, oh, well, you can't get addicted to marijuana. That's actually not true. Not very many people get addicted to marijuana, and there are some reports of physiological dependence, but mostly not. However, there are definitely psychological dependence to using marijuana on a regular basis. So just like wanting to be high rather than wanting to be in the real world, like really, really badly, and not being able to function in the real world without being a little stoned. So just keeping that in mind. Dependence doesn't have to be physiological dependence, but it can be. And drug dependence is defined as a behavioral disorder. Okay. So people often say like, oh, drug use is so bad for you, or drug use is so bad now, and it used to not be, and it's out of control now, and it didn't used to be. That's just a bunch of BS. So drug use is not new. Throughout history, I mean throughout history, drugs have been used. They've been used for enhancing spiritual experiences. They've been used as major economic roles. They've been used for treatment of illnesses, okay? Some things have happened in the past century. There's been a rise of legal pharmaceuticals for a variety of purposes, right? So good things like vaccines. There are things like birth control. There are things like mental health treatments, okay? There's also this whole rise of the war on drugs. Now, if you watched the videos that I asked you to watch on marijuana, I think the first one really addresses some of that war on drugs issue. We haven't won the war. We may need to change how we're planning to fight this quote unquote war. but these are some things that have happened really in the past century. If you're not familiar with this concept, do a bit more reading about it in your book. One of the interesting, this is sort of a side comment here, is one of the interesting things about teaching this class is that some of the students in the class are young and new to college and don't have a lot of background. And there are other people who maybe are taking this as one of their last classes and have a significant background. So I often will say, you know, if you aren't familiar, go ahead and look up in your book so that I don't spend a whole bunch of time boring people with information that already know it. But yet I do give some of the information for people that don't know it. Anyway, just letting you know. It's a little bit of a challenge, and that's why I do it the way I do it. All right, moving on. Extent of drug use. So the question is always like, how many people are using these drugs? What's the percentage? Blah, 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 right? Turns out it is not easy to get accurate or complete information on the number of drug users, how much of an illicit drug is imported, how much of an illicit drug is sold. It's difficult to get information on the usage of legal drugs, such as alcohol, tobacco, prescription drugs. I mean, first of all, people don't want to tell you, right? What you'd have to go like knocking on every single person's door and ask, and then they'd probably lie to you or not want to talk to you, right? There's also the other problem, which is when you do give out some of these surveys, some people think it's hilarious to lie and say that they're doing way more than they are. So the information is not necessarily accurate or complete. However, we keep doing these survey questionnaires anyway because, one, they're easy to use and they're inexpensive, and you can survey a lot of people pretty quickly, pretty easy, pretty inexpensive. Now, there's bias in student populations. There's potential inaccuracy of self-reports. But we keep doing it, and what's interesting is that when we keep doing it, we look at, let me go back real quick here. When we keep doing this, we look at all the different studies and we can compare them to one another. And although they may not be completely accurate, a lot of the studies show the same trends. And if multiple studies show the same trends, we can be more confident that they are somewhat accurate, at least in their trends. That is, and when I say trends, I mean, you know, drug use was the highest in the 80s and has declined in the 90s, and it's still not as bad now as it was in the 80s. Things like that. We can look at those kind of trends, and if multiple studies show the same thing, we can be more likely to trust it. Okay. Populations of users. So there are a wide range of rates and amounts of use, even within substance using populations. So even when we look at people that are in substance use treatment centers, you have a wide range of rates and amount of use. And this is true of all drugs of abuse. So the range of users actually has pretty important implications for when we look at prevention efforts, when we look at treatment efforts, when we look at law enforcement, and when we look at the nature of dependence. Now, each one of these bullet points we will focus more on later in the semester. There's a whole chapter on prevention. There's a whole chapter on treatment. But again, this is something that you may want to look in chapter 1 and do a little bit further exploring, just to give you some base. Okay. So one of the big surveys that was done is called the MTF. So, which is the monitoring the future project. Okay, monitoring the future project. This has been done for a long time, and every year. So they do this survey every year. It's been done for almost 40 years. And what they do is they look at, this particular study looks at 8th grade through 12th grade and college students. Now, they look at the prevalence of drug use, meaning how many people are using the drug, using drugs in general, lots of different drugs. And then also they collect data on people's perceived risk and the availability of different drugs. So they're going to ask, basically, here's what they say. So on the different surveys, they go through each different drug and they say, you know, are you using this? They say, how many other people do you know that use this? They say, how perceived risk is, you know, on a scale from this to this, how bad for you do you think this is? How dangerous do you think this drug is? And then also, how available is this drug? How likely is it that you could just go out and get it if you wanted it? So they're looking at that, and like I said, it's showing trends over time. So although the actual number of drug users, the actual perceived risk, the actual everything may not be completely accurate, if we look at it every year over time, we can get trends and see when trends go up for certain drugs and when trends go down for certain drugs. Okay, and here is a little graph that we can look at here. And this is, of course, that study we were just talking about. And we have availability, risk, and use. And you can see over the years, availability hadn't changed so much, right? However, we had this peak of use in the 80s, and then it dropped. Well, we always talk about it being the peak use in the 80s. This is interesting. Okay, but then we can see the drop of use in the 90s, and then a slow increase, but not back up to the point where it was. To tell you the truth, now that I'm looking at this graph, it looks more like end of the 70s was the peak use. However, when we, all the books, everything always talks about peak use being in the 80s. So this graph may not be perfect here, whoever put it together. Anyway, you still get the idea. And you also get to see when risk, perceived risk goes up, use goes down. Another study, which is fairly similar, is the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. Okay, this is a fantastic study because people have access to it. People meaning academics, researchers can get their hands on this data and they can do their own data analyses with it, which is just fantastic, I think. It gathers data from U.S. households, okay, not just students. They actually do face-to-face interviews, which means you're going to get better data than if you just sent out surveys. It looks at people ages 12 and older, and again, it's been conducted every year for over 40 years. So if you wanted to look at the trends of a certain drug, or you wanted to look at who's using this drug and who has had trauma experiences, or who's using this drug and who has tried to kill themselves in the past, and look at sort of correlations that way, you can do that for these large numbers of people that they have interviewed. Okay, they look at prevalence of drug use and frequency of drug use. And then they actually, like I was saying, they actually do look at some of these other mental health factors, physical factors, things like that. And again, though, it's showing trends over time. Now, within the households, we see a similar thing here, right? Sort of peak near the 80s, and then a drop in the 90s, and then a slow increase. So, woohoo! The great thing here is we get to see that the trends of both studies are very similar. So, we can then say there's a good chance that this is accurate, generally, okay? Here's just another graph that shows us the National Survey on Drug, and we have percentage reporting use, and then, of course, the years of very specific things, so alcohol, marijuana, cocaine. I mean, it'll be interesting to see how things change now that marijuana has become legal in so many states. More people are likely to report having used it. So we shall see. All right. So data from both things can be examined together, as I said. Finding similar patterns in two different studies using different sampling techniques gives us a stronger indication that these trends are actually real and reflect broad changes in American society over time. I've already said that, so we're good. Okay. Now, let's talk about correlation versus causation. This is a big thing. Okay. Now, when two things correlate, that means that they happen together. So I'll give you a real simple example. The more donuts I eat, the more my weight goes up. These two things are correlated. Donut intake and weight are correlated. Okay? Now, I don't know for sure that it's the cause unless I do a study that shows that if all things are the same, then yes, the donuts are causing my weight to go up. Okay? Now, most likely that is the cause, but that's not really the point here. The point is that a lot of the statistics that we look at are saying one variable is related to something else, such as drug use. And those are correlates, not necessarily causes. The example that I always give, if you've had my class before, you'll know this. But the example that I give is a birth control via toaster method. Okay, that sounds weird, right? Let me go back here. There's a study that shows that people who have more small appliances in their homes, so people that have more small appliances, like toasters, are less likely to have unplanned pregnancies. So these things are correlated. More small appliances, less unplanned pregnancies. Now, if we're going to jump to a cause, then we would be saying that the small appliances are causing people to not have unplanned pregnancies. You should see that as crazy, just to be real clear, okay? It is highly unlikely that this is causing this. They're correlated though. Now, there's probably another factor in here, right? People with more small appliances are probably also people that have more money and are more educated. We also know that higher education and higher income is related to fewer unplanned pregnancies. Okay, so these are our mediating or moderating factors that go in here. It's really, really important that you understand that correlation, which we will talk often about in this class related to drugs, does not necessarily mean that it is the cause. If that makes sense to you, remember that I will ask you a question about it on your exam. If it does not make sense to you, I want you to go to your book and do some reviewing on it. You can probably Google it. People feel pretty strongly about this issue. Or you can email me and I'd be happy to explain it more. Okay? So main thing here is that correlation does not necessarily mean causation. Okay? I'm going to move on. But again, if you're confused by that, look it up or let me know. Risk factors for adolescent drug use. Okay? So, and this is, we're going to talk about the correlations here. Having friends who use drugs or engaging in antisocial activities. So, correlationally, people who have friends who use drugs are more likely to use drugs themselves. That is a correlation. Now, we don't know that that's the cause. So we don't know that having friends who use drugs is the cause, because maybe somebody who is more likely to use drugs is also then going to seek out friends who use drugs. We don't know, but we do know that these are correlated. So if we see that they have friends who are using drugs, we know that it is more likely that they are using drugs. Okay? Engaging in antisocial activities. We see a correlation with people who are engaging in antisocial activities are more likely to be using drugs. Again, is it the antisocial activities that are causing them to use the drugs? We don't know that. We just know that they're correlated. Maybe it's people that are using drugs are more likely to engage in antisocial activities. Maybe one is causing the other. Maybe they just go together. They're correlational. They're informational. But we are not saying that one causes the other for sure. Now, same thing here, protective factors. Perception of a strong sanctions against use. So that means you think that that you will get in trouble for using, okay? If you think that it is very likely that you will get in trouble for using, you're less likely to use. Having parents as social support, okay? So people that have parents as social support are less likely to then use drugs as adolescents. Now, it's also possible that adolescents who are less likely to use drugs are also more likely to see their parents as social support. So again, we don't know the cause. However, knowing that there's a correlation here, parents do strive, or should strive, to be social supports for their adolescents in hopes that that will help them not use drugs that they don't want them to be using. Okay. But we don't know that it's causational. Again, hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, let me know. Okay, other correlates. Now I'm going to go through these. You know that these are correlational. That doesn't mean that they are for every single person, because we're talking statistically here. And we're not saying that one thing causes another. But gender. Men use more drugs than women. As a generalization, statistically, men use more drugs than women. Race and ethnicity. Whites are more likely to drink alcohol than African Americans. Level of education. College graduates are less likely to smoke tobacco than people with only a high school degree. Personal variables. So impulsive individuals may use drugs at a higher rate. Genetics. Genetics may play a role in who will develop a substance use disorder. So meaning if you have a family member who had a substance use disorder, statistically you're more likely to have a substance use disorder. Doesn't mean you absolutely will, but statistically you're more likely to. Correlations here. Correlates. All right. New word, antecedent. You want to know it. So an antecedent is a factor that occurs before an event, such as beginning use of drugs or initiation of drug use. It's not necessarily the cause, but we see it happen first. Okay? So if we see aggressiveness in a child, often we see aggressiveness, and then we often see that they are someone who uses drugs later. Conduct problems, meaning that they, maybe get in trouble at school, they bully other people, things like that, conduct issues. Maybe they steal, lie, those things. Okay. Poor academic performance, attachment to drug-using peer group, and parental and community norms that support drug use. If we see these things, we can guess that in the future, this person is more likely to use drugs than someone that does not have these antecedents. Okay, so an antecedent is a factor that occurs before an event. Make sure you wrote it down. All right. Oh, gateway substances. So there are kind of two things to say here. And one is that a gateway substance is one of the first drugs that is used by a typical drug user. alcohol, tobacco, sometimes marijuana are considered gateway drugs. And what that means is that for people that later use heroin, cocaine, things like that, they often first started with alcohol, tobacco, marijuana, and then got into the drugs that they're in. So that's why we call them gateway substances. Now, let me say this a little bit different here, and that is that using alcohol, tobacco, or marijuana does not mean that somebody will progress to using heroin, cocaine, things like that. So the gateway is not inevitable. It's just one of the first drugs used by a typical drug user, but does not mean they will absolutely use other drugs in the future. A lot of people don't. A lot of people use alcohol, maybe experiment with tobacco, maybe use marijuana, and have no interest in using other drugs. But we call it this gateway substance. Okay, they are early indicators of basic patterns of deviant behavior and may be resulting from a variety of risk factors. Okay, look at these cool kids. Just kidding. There are several influences of drug use. So this is why do people use? What are the motivations? What are the motives here? Maybe you identify with a, quote, deviant subculture. So maybe you're like, well, I smoke cigarettes because that's what I do, and I'm a smoker, and all my friends are smokers. Okay, so you identify with it, so that's what you do. Rebelliousness, just, you know, F my parents, I'm going to go out and drink and smoke weed. Yay. Fads, cultural trends, right? So, gosh, like certain drugs that we will talk about that sometimes you will see like celebrities all of a sudden are using, not now, but there was a period of time where all the celebrities were like using salvia, and Miley Cyrus was using salvia, and all of a sudden it became really trendy briefly. We will talk about what that is, I promise. Reinforcing properties of drugs. I mean, this is a huge one as to why people use, right? They like the way it feels, or they like the way it allows them to not feel other ways, okay? And just simply the desire to experience an altered state. I mean, if you think about little kids, little tiny kids spin themselves in circles. They spin and spin and spin until they are dizzy, and they think it's awesome. This is one of our first signs that humans, a lot of humans, like an altered state. They enjoy it. And then when you get older, instead of spinning in circles, maybe you start using alcohol, and maybe you start using, you know, hallucinogens or whatever it is. But just that simple desire to experience an altered state. Now, to be clear, there are other people who hate feeling in that altered state. So, excuse me, not everybody. Now, here's our last slide for this chapter. And this is influences on drug use. Okay, we can look at this from many areas. There's our individual things, our personality, our attitudes, our beliefs, our motives, our needs, our biology. Then outside of that is our community and family. What influences us there is our family, our peers, our schools, our churches, our clubs, our organizations, gangs, local police. And then outside of that even are societal influences on drug use, laws, availability, commercials, statements by celebrities or authorities, portrayal in the news, portrayal in movies, advertisements, and political statements. There's so much here, and that's really the point, is there are so many different levels, there's so many different layers of why people use drugs. What are the influences on people who use drugs? And I mean, there are so many different kinds of drugs. Lots of influences here. Okay, I'm going to leave you with that. Feel free to go back if you missed something that I said. Feel free to go back to just, rewind this, go back, or go to your book. And I will see you in the next chapter. All right.